Okay, so for the land protection plan, we talked about in our last affiliate meeting how the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is taking on a project to expand the Patuxent Research Refuge in Southern Maryland and establish a land protection plan for Southern Maryland. And since our last meeting, we had the stakeholder meeting for this project. So essentially, we gathered a bunch of stakeholders and presented on the plan or the project and tried to gather feedback from the stakeholders and kind of pinpoint areas of concern. So there were about 70 attendees, and the presentation basically explained the process of the refuge expansion and how the concept maps were formed. And we're very excited about this project as SMCA, and we think it could be a great step toward increasing land conservation in Southern Maryland. So we really want to make sure that our members are staying updated on all that's happening with it, and that everyone understands the project clearly so as to be able to communicate it with others and also just to give it your full support. So this is the overview of the process for approving a refuge. So as you can see, it began in 2011 with the preliminary project proposal. This map on the left is an outcome of that. And then in 2018 began the conservation design. The map on the right is from that. And now we are in the spring of 2023 working on the land protection plan and environmental assessment. So this is the concept map presented. And Dan and others working on this have been working on communication materials to concisely explain the project and to address frequently asked questions. So far they've created an elevator speech to summarize everything going on. So this is the elevator speech. The really condensed version is that U.S. Fish and Wildlife proposes to expand the Patuxent Research Refuge located in Laurel, Maryland, to include and ultimately conserve currently unprotected high priority fish and wildlife habitats across Southern Maryland. And then a little bit more detailed, in collaboration with landowners, outdoor enthusiasts, conservation partners, and local communities, the service proposes to identify new refuge boundaries within which the service would have the authority to purchase land or interests in land, conservation easements, from willing sellers in the Maryland counties of Calvert, Charles, St. Mary's, Prince George's, and Anne Arundel. Extensive research and data collection and analysis over the past 15 years have shown that currently unprotected habitats in these counties support significant populations of fish and wildlife and have been identified by the Service for Protection by the National Wildlife Refuge System. Primarily threatened and endangered species, waterfowl, and migratory birds of conservation concern. These species face the threat of habitat loss from land use changes, climate change, competition from invasive species, and other external population stressors. Acquisition and protection of lands as part of the refuge system in conjunction with land conservation efforts by a strong coalition of partners in Southern Maryland will help ensure the health and vitality of fish and wildlife habitat well into the future. A public review of the draft proposal currently under preparation by the service is expected to begin in spring 2023. So I'm going to hand this over to Dan to talk about the next steps. And we kind of just wanted to give some time for people to ask questions if they have any about this, because again, we really want our members to understand what this project is.
Yeah. You covered it well, Mary. So as far as next steps go, we are currently, Joe McCauley, myself, and some others are beginning to work on the document, the land protection plan, environmental assessment document that we hope to have done a draft of sometime this coming spring. We are taking another look at our concept map based on comments we got from some of the stakeholders and other factors, I guess I would say. And but it's probably not good. The boundaries, it's looking like the boundaries are not going to change very much. And we are in the process of putting together a frequently asked questions sheet and also the elevator speech, which we drafted and Mary just ran through. So we're also going to send those FAQs and the elevator speech out to the stakeholders, including the SMCA membership, and the either the recording and or the transcripts of the stakeholder meeting. We haven't, if we can't send out the recording because it's too big, or we can't send a link to it, we'll wind up just sending the transcripts. And let's see.
Dan, we could help you with that, with turning it into a YouTube video, if that would work for you.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. We'll see what, I'll talk to you about that, Greg.
Okay.
But one thing is, when we send the FAQs and the elevator speech out, we're going to send either the transcripts and or or a link to the
Gotcha.
recording.
Sounds good.
So once we have a draft of the LPP, we'll be going through the NEPA process, which, well, we are kind of going through it right now, actually. You know, we started it with the stakeholder meeting, but we're going to, it'll go out for, the document itself will go out to public review for a number of days. I think it's at least 30 days. And folks will get another chance to comment, provide comments to us at that time. We also can be made available to talk to various groups about the plan as well as we're working through the process. I think that's it. Joe, if you can hear me, did I miss anything?
No, I think you covered. Can y'all hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
I'm in a really tricky spot. I've never done a Zoom on my phone before.
It sounds like you're hanging off the phone's cliffs.
You know, I'm actually overlooking the Rappahannock River. So,
That's what I thought.
I'm sitting on a national wildlife refuge, so
There you go.
at least I'm in sync in that way. But no, I think you covered it. The only question I would have for this group is based on, you know, what you heard Mary read. Does that seem adequate as, you know, a summary to share with folks who are just, you know, curious about what's going on and what we're thinking and what we're planning? I just want to make sure that's you know, complete.
I thought I like both the short and the long version. The elevator speech itself can't be too long, and that was pretty nice and concise. And then you provide a little bit more meat to it in the longer version, which I think should answer most questions for people, at least that in my mind, it should answer a lot of questions.
And so we'll
Good.
go ahead, Joe.
I'll just say that's good. It's currently under review by, you know, all those that need to review it with Fish and Wildlife, which is probably a number of folks. But once it's through that review, we'll make sure we get it out so it can be used.
Great.
Yeah, so I guess the hope is that, you know, stakeholders, including SMCA members, will have a good understanding of what we're, you know, the process we're going through, and convey that to others as we move through the process. And any one of us, whether it's Fish and Wildlife or the various stakeholders, get questions from, you know, partners or the public or political folks, we have good answers, and we're all singing the same tune. I think that's it. Unless anybody has more questions or comments.
I just want to say I talked about this with one of our friends groups and they did have some questions. I remember one question was whether US Fish and Wildlife would preserve agricultural land in Southern Maryland.
Yeah, we will. Typically when we use our funding to protect farmland, it's associated with fish and wildlife habitat as well. So usually there's a large woodland or wetland associated with the farm fields. But typically, when we protect a piece of property in this area, in this region, I should say, 7 times out of 10, there's a farm field associated with it. And if it's a conservation easement and the farmer wants to continue to farm, that's usually okay. It's always okay from my experience. If we purchase land in fee, we may decide to keep it in agriculture, or we might restore it to some other type of habitat, depending on the situation in the area that we're working.
And I'll just add a little bit to that. Typically, if the refuge system buys land in fee, he would seek to restore whatever habitat, and make all that habitat available for wildlife. So there's cooperative farming used to be a widespread practice on refuges, and in recent decade or decade and a half, it's changed. That policy has changed, and lands are more typically restored. But that's why easements are such a great tool, and why easements are in our refuge system tool bag, is to use those where the situation calls for it, and where the landowner would like to keep some land in production, then that can be accomplished through a conservation easement.
So my only comment on this is that when you folks are ready to share this stuff, I know this is still in draft form, but when you're ready to share, my ask to all of the member affiliate groups that are out there is please put the word out, share that information, because we may need a lot of friends, so to speak, who knows, and providing good information is one of the best ways to diffuse concerns.
Yeah.
Yep.
Hi, Dan, this is Fatima Hassan. I have a question with the properties that, let's say, that might go under conservation easement. They would be so they would be part of the Patuxent Research Refuge. Is that correct?
They wouldn't be owned by the Fish and Wildlife Service. The Fish and Wildlife Service would hold the easement. So they would still be private property. We use these easements in addition to fee as a means of protecting land, particularly if a landowner wants to keep ownership of the land. We have that option of using easements rather than fee, simple purchase, but the property remains in private ownership.
That's true. But if let's say the refuge, the refuge is going to have an authorization limit. There will be a limit on the number of acres that the service, Fish and Wildlife Service, is authorized to acquire under this proposal. And easements and fee both count toward that total. So, they are part of the National Wildlife Refuge System, even if it's in fee. And it does, as Dan said, they remain in private ownership, but they do count toward the overall cap that is set.
Thanks, Fatima. Good to see you.
Okay, well, if anyone has any other questions or comes up with questions, feel free to reach out to Dan. But I think we should get moving on.
Thanks, Mary.
Thank you, Dan.
Thanks, Mary. This is Joe. I'm going to jump. Thank you.
All right, thanks for joining, Joe.
See you, Joe.
See ya.
So now we're going to talk about how much land we should aim to preserve in Maryland. But before that, I'm briefly going to recap some of what we talked about at the last affiliate meeting to kind of tie it together. So essentially, what are some of the biggest challenges facing preservation and how are we doing overall? So at our last affiliate meeting, recall how we discussed the importance of land preservation, what options there are in Southern Maryland to preserve land, and how to talk to landowners about preserving their land. And in establishing the importance, we talked about, of course, the rapid pace of development we're seeing in Southern Maryland. As you can see from the maps, development increased drastically in the 37-year period of 1973 to 2010. We went from 10.5% developed to 27%. And we lost 1 million acres to sprawl in this time period. And more than 60% of Maryland's developed land currently was developed during this time period. But despite these challenges, we've made some great progress in land preservation. On a per acre basis, we have probably preserved as much or more than any other state in the country, but we are also the 5th most densely populated state, which means that any lands unprotected are at threat of being developed to accommodate population growth. So now that we know land preservation is important, this isn't new, but and sprawl development continues to threaten our region's remaining natural lands, we need goals to make progress happen. So what should these goals be for Maryland? We're all aware of the 30 by 30 goal enacted by the Biden administration to preserve 30% of US lands by 2030. And this is an ambitious target, but is this where we should stop? Or should we aim for 40 by 40 or even 50 by 50? So what metric should we use to determine this goal? Many scientific opinions currently are actually recommending that 50 by 50 is the target we should aim for. The World Conservation Congress of the International Union for Conservation of Nature approved Motion 101 this year, which calls for the protection of 50% of the Earth's lands and seas with a minimum of 30% by 2030. So with the impacts of climate change, we realize that humanity desperately needs the ecosystem services provided by natural places, and we should aim to preserve 50% of these places. Further support for the 50 by 50 is from the 2019 publication, A Global Safety Net to Reserve Biodiversity Loss and Stabilize Earth's Climate. And this study found that 50.4% of the Earth's terrestrial surface is key to the survival of biodiversity, storing an estimated 2 trillion tons of carbon. And so along with the report, they published this map, which shows a global scale analysis of areas requiring protection to solve the crisis of biodiversity loss and climate change. And so they analyzed each country differently. So the percent that needs to be protected for each country varies. But for the US, they found that 50.1% preserved should be the target. So since 50% is recommended for the US by scientific sources such as the Global Safety Net Report and the IUCN, this seems like a pretty strong goal to have. But where does Maryland stand in relation to these goals and what will it take to achieve them? So Greg put together this chart and did the number crunching himself. So after taking out waterways, Maryland has roughly 6 million acres of land, 1.8 of which is already preserved, or 1.8 million, and 1.8 million which is already developed, which leaves 2.6 million acres of land uncommitted, therefore at threat of development. And so to achieve the 30 by 30 goal, we're at 29%. So we would need 66,450 more acres. And for 40 by 40, we would need 688,000 acres. And then for 50 by 50, we need to preserve half of the remaining land that's uncommitted. So that's about 1.3 million acres. And as a state, Maryland needs to decide what this goal is. So in talking about land preservation, of course, we're talking about a variety of different types of land, not just agriculture, but agriculture is one of the most important types of land to preserve, especially with climate change threatening our global food systems. We need to strengthen our local food systems in order to ensure that we have food when there are disruptions to the global food supply chain because of climate change, natural disasters, or pandemic similar to COVID. We also need to preserve access to natural lands for urban areas, because if we're advocating for urban areas to be one of the best places to live, people in these areas also need access to natural areas. Green and blue infrastructure is our natural support system, providing ecosystem services that are necessary to humans and plants and animals. And as Maryland's population increases, these natural systems are being lost to development. So this is going to be a key type of land to protect. And then wildlife habitats and corridors, of course, are also important to strengthen our region's biodiversity, because development tends to fragment habitats, and this makes populations smaller. It disrupts the gene flow between populations and makes them more susceptible to natural disasters or genetic drift, or like diseases that would threaten a population. So how do we increase the pace of preservation, which we need to do in order to achieve these ambitious goals? The main thing we need is more money. And we need legislation that establishes a revolving loan fund for land trusts to buy properties that come up for sale. We also need to incentivize land preservation more, in that we ensure that private landowners will financially benefit more for preserving their land, and this means valuing land for buffers, wetland protection, old growth forests, and stuff like that. One example is rural legacy, which allows counties to create an easement valuation formula to add these values up to 80% of the appraised value of the land. So with these scientifically backed goals to preserve 50% of the land, what can we expect Southern Maryland to look like? So I know a lot of our core members have heard us already talk about these blogs, but at ACLT, we've been working on a series of blogs to sort of establish this vision for Southern Maryland to support the mission of SMCA. So we have 3 blogs currently that we're working on. And so I'm going to go over those briefly. And our hope is that our affiliate and core members can use these blogs as they would like to share on their various platforms, so that we can support the mission of SMCA across a wider platform. So blog 1, titled Think Southern Maryland, gives an overview of what makes Southern Maryland special. So when you think of Southern Maryland, what comes to mind? We talk about its big rivers, deep deciduous forests, abundant ecological services, and rich cultural heritage. We describe the geographical layout of the region as being bounded on the west by the Potomac and the east by the Chesapeake Bay. To give kind of a broad historical context, we talk about how early colonists settled here for its temperate climate, good farm soils, and abundant access to waterways, and how our nation's first attempt at accepting religious freedom was enacted in Southern Maryland. And then, of course, Southern Maryland's history began long before colonists arrived. The Piscataway Confederacy had already established villages and practiced a very sustainable form of agriculture here. And then we go into why people should care about protecting land here, because of course, Southern Maryland's waterways are ideal for boaters and fishermen. Its deciduous forests are the largest in the state, and they support a wide variety of wildlife, a timber harvest industry, and dozens of miles of hiking trails. And of course, our invaluable green infrastructure, forests, meadows, bogs, and marshes, which attenuate stormwater, soak up excess nutrients, store carbon, and provide habitat for all the region's animals. Then blog 2 gives an overview of how rural lands on the East Coast changed in the 20th century. So to kind of establish, again, why land preservation is so important now. So during the 20th century, livestock and grain agriculture scaled up and moved west. Trade agreements allowed the US to import agriculture products from countries where they were produced at a lower cost. And so local farmers were outcompeted and forced to sell their land. A lot of this land, which was lost to sprawl development. Many felt these effects, but of course, minority landowners were disproportionately impacted. So we talk about the Pigford lawsuits, which confirmed that the USDA was discriminating against Black farmers seeking farm assistance programs, necessitating a lot of them to end up selling their land, and how the heirs property issue meant that many financially stressed landowners were exploited by external entities who would buy up their share of ownership in the land and then force a sale of the land. And so because of these different factors, New England began the RCP network because they were really starting to see their landscape be carved up by development and needed a solution. And then we talk about more specifically how Southern Maryland was impacted by these changes. So at the beginning of the 20th century, all 5 counties were dominated by farming, forestry, and fisheries. However, proximity to the nation's capital caused development pressures, causing much of our land to be lost to suburban sprawl. And the seafood industry was harmed by worsening water quality, sediment pollution, and over-harvesting. And so between 1939 and 2012, farm acreage decreased between 54% and 82%. So this is the one where we kind of want feedback from our affiliates on. We have outlined a vision for Southern Maryland, basically just compiling a list of bullet points of what Southern Maryland will look like if we achieve the land preservation goals we've been talking about. So I'm going to go over these, but we really want to hear back from our affiliate, from you guys. So after this, I'm going to have us go to Menti to leave comments if you so wish. So just a heads up on that, but I'm going to go over these bullet points real quick. So if we achieve our land preservation goals, submerged aquatic vegetation will return to the Patuxent, and crabs and juvenile fish will populate the shoreline. The Potomac's native SAV continues to thrive and expand all along the river. Electric fishing boats cruise along the shorelines, occasionally hooking smallmouth bass and rockfish. Wildlife corridors along the rivers increase the abundance of wildlife species. More natives rebound in numbers, some even return, like bobcats and mink. Hunters yield abundant numbers of ducks in the fall. Fishermen see a return of migrating fish species as scientists document the return of stronger white perch and yellow perch runs in the spring. Southern Maryland becomes a popular destination for DC residents seeking outdoor fun, such as canoeing, kayaking, fishing, hiking, and bicycling. Residents of urban areas have greater access to natural landscapes. At strategic locations along the Patuxent and Potomac, rental businesses supply electric boats for bird watchers and others seeking scenic tours. There are stops along the Captain John Smith Historic Trail for paddlers. Towns and businesses serving locally sourced vegetables, seafood, meats, and drink become experience destinations. There are well-signed bicycle paths found along rural byways throughout the region, and they tell the history of the region and what natives you might see. And new rural residential sprawl disappears from the landscape as landowners realize their land's value as green infrastructure is more valuable than selling it for development. So that is everything we have at this moment. So if you want to provide any feedback, you can scan this QR code or go to menti.com and enter this code, and there should be a prompt there for you.
A little yellow prompt when you point your phone to the that QR code, you see just this little yellow prompt, and you click on that.
So I'll give
And-
everyone a second to do so. Michelle, to your comment, I really like the idea of a hashtag. We haven't looked into that yet though, but I think Southern Maryland would be a good one. And then David asking about the slides. Are you asking about the the LPP slides?
Yes, and also these slides that you have today, if possible.
Yes, I'll share these slides after the meeting. And I believe Dan will be sharing a transcript of the meeting or a recording as well as the FAQs.
Thank you.
Hi there, this is Virginia. I was trying to enter the menti.com webpage and I entered the code and do I need to leave a space between those two sets of numbers? Because I entered it, I think, correctly and I couldn't get it to work. Did anyone else get it to work?
There, I just tried the code at the top of this page, the 612. Oh, it just disappeared. That worked. The first code did not work. The one that's at the top of the page, Mary was just displaying, that worked. But the one in the slideshow by the QR code didn't work.
Okay. can
Okay,
you-
so use the one on this slide. If it doesn't work, we were having some issues with Menti, but it was working when we did our latest run through. But if not, we'll just move
Okay.
on. Yes, Frank?
Going back to strategy, I do have a question. Obviously, the 30% or 50% that was discussed by the UN was for ecological services, I believe. And our protection also includes farmland. A lot of farmland, of course, is providing little or no ecological services. How do we want to address that?
I would say, for one thing, that it does provide some ecological services. And also, going back to Dan Murphy's point, most farms are, at least in my experience, are roughly 50% farm fields. And most of the rest could be wetlands, woodlands, et cetera, which are good habitat areas. So I don't think for preserving farmland, we are still achieving the goals.
At least
Right.
partially, yes. And also, in some cases, where there are developments that are older or in place that would be getting into some of the critical properties, the critical areas for land protection, would we longer term want to have goals of maybe doing buyback or something like that in those areas?
Yeah, that's a good point. That's something to be considered.
Thanks.
Emma has her hand raised.
Thank you all for letting me sit in today. I'm still learning about your organization. This is exciting to get to know about your work. So I was wondering if you could teach me a little bit more about what it looks like when a land trust such as yourself does take on property and what that management looks like. And I was also wondering if that includes any collaboration with local Indigenous groups.
So first of all, what does it look like with respect to how the land looks after a land trust protects it? There's both easement preservation or conservation and also land purchase. ACLT, just as one example, we do both. We have lands that we hold easements on that many of them continue to be farms. And we monitor them every year to be sure that they're in compliance with all of the ecosystem service requirements and the land use. On ACLT, the lands that we own, we very proactive with respect to stewardship of the lands for wildlife habitat and fisheries. And we're constantly monitoring streams and our forests and our wetlands and addressing invasive species and so forth. So when land trusts own land, of course, they have more flexibility in terms of stewardship than with lands we hold easements, but both can be very effective tools to provide good habitat.
Thank
Any
you.
other questions?
Thank you everyone for the feedback. We will keep looking at these, and I will also send out our blogs, the full version, in the follow-up email for people to look at and offer comments after today's meeting as well. But I think for now, we should move on. So I'm going to stop sharing, and Greg is going to pull up his slides.
So if we're ever going to protect Southern Maryland's ecosystems, we need a change in perspectives about the real economic assets of our region. There's an old real estate axiom that says the three most important things when looking for a property are location, location, location. For business, great transportation access is often key. However, large portions of Southern Maryland are distant peninsulas and remote rural byways that have not been able to compete for manufacturing and office parks due to their limited access to rail, commercial airports, or interstate highways. Partially for that reason, these peninsulas and remote rural byways happen to be rich in ecosystem services. For many centuries, though, having great land transportation access did not matter. The economy was focused on two industries that could thrive on peninsulas in rural areas, fishing and farming. Rolling roads were used to haul farm products to landings, and sailboats carried goods and passengers much more easily than travel over rugged dirt roads with gates wherever a road crossed a property line. And yes, that was the case. Those two industries are still here. They're not nearly as profitable as 100 years ago. Tobacco barns are still there, dotting the landscape. Grain has, for the most part, replaced tobacco. There's still workboats on the water. Southern Maryland museums tell the history of all this well. And both farming and fisheries industries have experienced a small rebound in the 21st century, both due in part to the local food movement, and the latter due to the improving Chesapeake Bay water quality. Even by the dawn of the 21st century, land travel was challenging, particularly in rural areas. The best form of transportation was a steamboat, which plied the waters in the Chesapeake Bay from 1813 to 1940. And for a time, there were up to 600 vessels that reached 300 locations in an intricate network of crisscrossing the bay and coursing up rivers. After World War II, Maryland underwent the same kind of housing boom as many other areas of the country. In fact, though, it was the third fastest growing in the nation in the 1940s. The first wave of government expansion after the Second World War brought new government workers from all over the nation. Developers found many farmers who were willing to sell, as farmers were having difficulty in competing with much larger farms in the Midwest and West. as Mary was talking about earlier. Then in 1956, President Eisenhower signed into legislation for the construction of the US interstate highway system, which also happened to allow commuters to live even further away from their place of work. And parts of Southern Maryland became targets for residential sprawl. Now, residential development generally does not pay its way, so elected officials in rural areas tried to bring manufacturing and office parks, and even more recently, high tech, to rural areas. However, manufacturers and warehouses, et cetera, don't come unless locations are next to an interstate highway or rail or airport facilities. And if they do build the industrial parks and office parks in rural areas without those amenities, you often find that the parks don't take off at all, or that they grow very slowly and many other uses go in besides the original intended uses. So what should be the future of Southern Maryland's economy? What are its natural economic assets? Because of its relative isolation, rugged lands, and our land preservation programs, Southern Maryland still has much of its wildlife habitat in place, potentially great access to coves, creeks, rivers, and the Chesapeake Bay. When Europeans started to colonize Maryland, they settled first near in Southern Maryland and Eastern Shore, getting that great access to the waterways. By comparison, in terms of how their areas were colonized, St. Mary's County was established in 1637, whereas Frederick County wasn't established until 1748, over 100 years later. So the geographic remoteness of Southern Maryland allowed much of it to remain ecologically intact. And I know many of you have seen this graphic, but it's still exciting to me. The darkest green area on these are the most resilient lands, according to the Nature Conservancy. The gray indicates lands that are already developed, and brown is least resilient lands. So looking in this area, much of the DC region, you find that the most resilient lands happen to be in Southern Maryland. Now, the Nature Conservancy has studied the resiliency of ecosystems based on a bunch of characteristics, including climate, hydrology of the soils, elevation, land use and connectivity, and microclimates. And in those places, there's the best opportunity for wide diversity of species of animals for hunting and animal watching, including these threatened that are on the screen here. And the big picture issue from an economic development standpoint is that green tourism in the US is really big. Hiking, biking, hunting, fishing, water sports, and outdoor activities now generate almost $900 billion a year in consumer spending, according to the Outdoor Industry Association. That makes outdoor recreation the fourth largest US business category in the country. And trails can not only take credit for a good portion of that impact, but also, though, for the benefit to society, other benefits to society. But to be truly sustainable, all three aspects of communities must be intact. There's got to be a strong social component, strong communities, a strong economic component, and a strong environmental component. Often jurisdictions focus on the economy, thinking that is the major driver. But if you don't have all three, you don't have a very sustainable community. So why do we need green tourism? Well, people in the region don't see the water or rural landscapes that often. In my county, you can drive all the way from where Route 4 crosses the river on Prince George's County, and you don't see another creek or river or anything until you get all the way down to Solomons. So most people living in our county, and I think it's true elsewhere, have no idea what watershed they live in, nor would they be likely to care about the health of waterways or wildlands that they never get access to. ACLT's byline has always been connecting people to the land, really connecting people to land and water. But it can also serve as green tourism for birders, hikers, fishermen, paddlers, etc., from the whole Baltimore, Washington metropolitan area, those seeking nature and its resources. So what do we need to improve green tourism? Well, longer hiking trails, connecting other parks and towns, more bikeable roads, more canoe and kayak launch sites, more local businesses and landowners involved in these things. And to think big picture, you can think no bigger than Benton Mackay, who conceived of the notion of the Appalachian Trail when he was standing on a mountain up in Maine and envisioned the possibility of a trail going all the way down to Georgia. And in fact, in no time, many people latched onto that vision and said, we can be part of this. And so section by section, the trail was built until we had a complete trail. At a much smaller scale, but in Calvert County, you had the creation of the Prince Frederick to Bay Trail. And that was when, at the time before I got here, the American Chestnut Land Trust conceived of possibility of walking from Prince Frederick all the way to a Chesapeake Bay overlook, 6.5 miles each way. The county commissioners and the economic development community bought into the notion of that possibility. And within 10 years, we had a complete trail from Prince Frederick to the Bay. So people want long hikes, they want short hikes. Some of them like real challenges. They'd like to walk for 10 to 15 miles in a day. But it's the variety that you find already in some of the parks in Southern Maryland. But there's so much more possibility to create new, exciting trails. So ACLT has trails, as you can see on the right-hand side, on the bay side of Route 4 that runs through the middle of the county. We have trails that do connect from the bay to Prince Frederick. But what about on the left side going toward the Patuxent River? I see 3 different options that you could, where you could actually have a river to bay walk, either going to Hunting Creek or Howling Point or down to Battle Creek. We'd love to see that opportunity happen, but it's going to take a lot of partners to make that happen. And the same kind of opportunities to happen in other counties. Now let's jump into bicycling. Well, that idea has already been thought about too. 1991, the East Coast Greenway concept was formed by that nonprofit to have the notion of being able to bicycle from Maine all the way down to Florida. And as of 2022, there's already a path that has been created for bicyclists, much of it along highways. But you also see a couple of locations where there's more than one option, more than one way to travel from north to south.
At 9:45 in the morning. Please bring your referral if one is required and a list of.
If somebody can mute their phone, please, that'd be great. So why not have a detour from the East Coast Greenway to run through Southern Maryland? I see possibilities for that to happen too. And there are already many partners in Maryland have signed on to this notion of improved trail systems through Maryland, including the Maryland Transportation Authority. And just this year, there were 3 major new additions to the East Coast Greenway these new sections that were built, which were off-road access trails. And of course, we have a couple of existing bicycle routes, Three Notch Trail in St. Mary's County, and Indian Head Trail in Charles County. So we've got beginnings of some great bicycle trails here. I think we need a coalition of bicyclists to work with us to make this happen. But I think it's never too early to get this started. And if you look at this map that the state has already provided of bicycle trails throughout Maryland, you'll notice that a lot of them the lines are in red, and that indicates that the hazard is greater for cycling there. And so what we need to do is to work to convince governments and also to get grants to utilize more of these safer bicycle route techniques that are available. A lot of it can happen on existing state roads and on shoulders and really vastly improve bicycle safety. All right, so let's jump into water access. And of course, there's already a vision out there for boating around to look at the historical assets in Southern Maryland and in the whole Bay region through the Captain John Smith Historic Trail. And focusing a little bit more in on Southern Maryland, you see that there are quite a few of these gateway sites in Southern Maryland where the little gray circles are. And there are more and more opportunities that are coming up. Mallows Bay is a huge success. It just happened in the last year or so on the left. And of course, there's a number of access points along the Patuxent River, including the Patuxent Riverkeeper site. There is a new site that opened up on St. Leonard Creek. But there are still a lot of places, a lot of creeks that don't have any public waterfront access. And I think it's to the detriment of the future of those creeks. Because again, if you don't have a group of friends to protect a creek, you likely are not going to have people that care if they're damaged. So at the end of this presentation, I'd like for all you to shout out some other places where you see where there could be improved public access to waterways. And then imagine if we had some real waterfront travel capacity come back. Imagine if the steamboats returned as solar electric boats. Well, the one on the right actually does run on the sun. And it's a pretty large sized boat that could carry a lot of people. And then I know we were all saddened over the fact that the nice bridge was not constructed with a walking path or a bike lane. But what if there was a pedestrian bicycle ferry that was located with a sign like this as you were coming up to the nice bridge? And one of these vessels was waiting there for you to come in, be a pedestrian to get across, or to put your bike in the back, or even to be able to have a space for a few canoes or kayaks to go from Maryland to Virginia. How cool would that be? I'll be honest with you, I believe the future of all boating is going to be electric. And I think that you will see solar panels within 10 years, you will see so many boats with solar panels, it'll be hard to believe. And then they will be by far the most eco-friendly form of transportation, as they are already in the world. There's no oil that spills off the back. They just run on the sun. And it's I actually have a little boat myself that runs on the sun, and it's really cool to have. And I don't miss mixing oil or cleaning up messes from motors at all. So what will it take to do more of this? Well, we need to have more paddling points. And why not create many of them on private property, where property owners can get some economic return for allowing people to launch boats off of their farm or off of their otherwise rural lands. Make it a conditional use in rural areas where there's waterfront property. And likewise, to address some of the issues of overnight stay, allow primitive campgrounds on rural properties, subject to conditions. We have both of those regs currently in Calvert County, and I would like to see other counties do the same, and that this whole notion of another way to get out on the waters would be greatly improved. All of this ties in very well with Southern Maryland's efforts to promote agritourism, heritage tourism, and local food systems. And so I've got a number of recommendations here for how we can do that. And you'll get these ahead of time. We're running close on our time here. But think about, I think there are action strategies that Southern Maryland and all of our affiliate groups could use to get more people out on land and water. And our counties have a history of working well with nonprofits. These are just a few examples in Calvert County. The Calvert Marine Museum, started by the Calvert County Historical Society. The county commissioners loved it, and then they started funding it. Battle Creek Cypress Swamp has greatly expanded the lands with the help of Calvert Nature Society. And then our own example with ACLT. I would like for us to come up with similar examples in all 5 counties so we can use to go back to the elected officials to say, hey, let's partner up and get some ecotourism that's going to benefit everybody. So that is, I think, my last slide. I'm going to stop sharing, and Mary, what are we going to do next?
Well, we're at time, but if anyone has any questions before we go, feel free to chime in.
And or creeks that you want to tell us we need access to.
David?
Yes, real quick. Thank you. Two issues from Charles County and La Plata. The town of La Plata is underway with a design of what they're calling a radio station walkway. It's on a county road, but we're under design to do a hiker biker trail that would connect St. Charles Parkway, which already has a hiker biker trail. It would run down Radio Station Road, connect with Maryland 488, then connect to Maryland 6, which is Charles Street, and then go all the way down into downtown La Plata. It would then connect up with a new development that was approved 35 years ago, and then it would go in and connect up with existing school sites. That design is underway, and they hope to submit the design to the state, hopefully within the next couple of months. And so the town received about a $385,000 grant. The town threw in some money, and then so we'll come back with a final design approval, and then we'll seek some additional grants to actually build it. The other issue is that Charles County, through their Parks and Recreation Department, they are underway to develop 3 new parks in the county, and I'm on their task force because one of the parks they're looking at, in fact, we met last night. One of the parks is it's down where, if you all know where Captain Billy's is. They bought the property to the south of Captain Billy where an old restaurant was located. And they've bought that property that has access to the Potomac River. And so they've hired a bunch of consultants, and they're looking at concept plans. And we got our first preview last night. And the main focus there would be to have passive campsites but preserve the waterfront for only beach access. But there's one proposal or one plan to also maybe have access for kayaks or rent kayaks. So I just wanted to bring those 2 new projects to the group. Thank you.
Exciting.
Great news. Frank?
Thank you. Yes, the Patuxent River Commission is looking to see what can be done to improve water access on the Patuxent, with a challenge coming to the counties probably in the near future to at least have one new water park along the Patuxent within 10 years.
Great.
Thank you. Fatima?
Yes, thank you, Greg, for the presentation. Will the slides be available or for looking at a later time? for us?
Yes.
Okay, that'd be great if you could send that out. And we have a network of bike and pedestrian facilities in Prince George's County that we can coordinate and connect to other counties. There have been connections, there are connections. And so I think someone that can speak to that is Michael Jackson, who is with us on our transportation planning section at this time. He joined us, I think, last year. He was previously he was with the Maryland Department of Transportation as their bicycle and pedestrian coordinator. So I think we have a great resource here in Southern Maryland to work on this. And if we have a meeting that focuses on biking and hiking trails and that kind of thing, I would be happy to invite him and see if if he can join us.
Thank you. That's wonderful.
Frank?
Thank you. Yes, I mentioned in the notes that we're starting a bicycle and pedestrian advocacy group. So anyone interested, if they can contact Greg or me about that, we'd like to see if we can augment what's going on with the Southern Maryland Conservation Alliance.
Thank you, Frank.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for coming. For our core members, we will be having our next core meeting on December 6th. But that's the only upcoming event. And Bonnie, I think, has a question before we go.
I'm sorry.
No, you're fine.
My question is about the Nice Bridge issue. The demolition is proceeding, but it could be halted. I like the idea of the having a ferry for the bicyclists, but I think that bridge, they did not follow NEPA. There was no public participation after the removal of the safety lane and the pedestrian and bicycle access. And I really think that we should consider asking for a pause to see if the demolition has proceeded to the point where it would be counterproductive to study the reuse of the bridge. And I'd just like to hear people, I mean, I don't think we're going to see the day when the ferry is sitting there for the pedestrians. I think that we will see that access would be a pivotal influence on more preservation in Southern Maryland.
Well, there was a lawsuit filed on it, and
I was in court, yes.
Yeah.
And they did not follow NEPA.
Yeah.
No public participation. I mean, it's federal money, a huge amount of federal money.
Yeah.
Could we see if we could find a politician to support looking at it? We withdrew from saying anything about it around the election because you didn't want to say something that might have any kind of influence on the election.
I'm at a loss on that one, but if there is a new governor coming in place, and so if anybody has the ears of anybody in the new administration, now would be the time to ask.
And we also have a good leadership in Region 3 of the EPA, because it's really a NEPA issue. I mean, the fact that the public money, the federal money, had they had tremendous public participation up until the point when they removed